Stony. So I've got this easy job of introducing Tara Ryder. If you don't know Tara, you don't live here. She's a boss. I got to know about Tara about before she even became one of the professors, and she was still a graduate student. And I heard about this student who knew all about the shipwrecks around Long Island. I thought, wow, how did she know? And but when I met her, it made sense because
she's not a
she isn't, but and if you want to know more about you go to the international programs. If you say I'm from SoMAS or sustainability, you know Tara Ryder? Everybody asks you if you know Tara Ryder. She takes all these kids to Ireland and it drives them crazy, and they still love her. So, in case you want to know more about Ireland, and now Russia, you're going to, what other program you've been doing?
England.
England?
That's not crazy.
But it was far away.
Not yet.
So, Taya got her bachelor's from LIU, the former Southampton campus, that nice place we acquired. And then she came here and did her PhD at Stony Brook. And she's an environmental historian. And what I'm going to read some of the things I can't quite remember here. So she does environmental humanities, both in SoMAS and the sustainability, which is now Big SoMAS. She's also director of the international academic programs, as I already mentioned, to Ireland, and normally our focus is culture and the landscape. Are we gonna play some Irish tunes?
We were threatening to make you guys dance in the middle of it.
Oh, okay.
We do have green caps for this one.
Oh, cool. So the other thing is, since 2015, she's been the public scholar of humanities in New York. This used to be the New York Council for Humanities, and she's also an associate editor for Long Island History Journal. And she specializes in the geopolitics of 16th century Ireland. That's cool.
There's
Just
pirates there.
16th?
No, it's based on piracy. Female pirates.
Yeah.
You know, they have a little fun.
Okay. And the other bit I would like to hear about, which I didn't know about, is the study includes how gender became symbolic for the turmoil involved in colonization. So, without further ado, I would like to present to you Tara Ryder. She's going to talk about how the maritime kind of shaped all the societies around the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Kamazima, for that introduction. I'm going to try not to shipwreck on this talk after that. So the title that was given to it was How Maritime Environments Have Shaped Societies Around the World. And I went, wow, you can't do that in 45 minutes because there's a lot of societies around the world. So we're going to kind of change this title a little bit and say how the marine environment shaped Long Island. And bring it to a society that you guys are particularly familiar with. And we're actually going to focus mainly on Suffolk County, looking at kind of our eastern area of it. So I'm assuming all of you know we're on Long Island. It's an island, it's surrounded by water, and thus we have to recognize how very influential it is to the cultures and societies that have lived here. We're going to focus mainly on the European societies as we're going forward. All good?
It's just better. It's really buzzy.
Oh, sorry.
It's better back there?
Am I buzzing again?
Better.
Oh, good. So what I wanted to just start with a little bit was we really came to this name of Long Island. If you think about it, it's not a particularly original name. If you go back to 1614, Adrian Block was one of the Dutch explorers. He was looking for furs. He had wandered into this area, was trading with some of the Native Americans in Manhattan, when by chance his boat caught on fire and burned down. Not particularly lucky for him, but he has built what is often considered probably the first European-built boat in the New World in 1614. He called it the Restless. And so he decided that before he returned back to the Netherlands with all of the furs that he had traded for, that perhaps this vessel should be tested out. And so he goes on a venture up the East River to see if this vessel is going to survive, and this is what he said about it. There runneth a violent stream both upon flood and ebb, and in the middle lieth some islands, rocks which the current set so violently upon that it threatens shipwreck, and upon the flood is a large whirlpool, which sends forth a hideous roaring enough to affright any stranger from passing any further. It was hell. Welcome to Hell's Gate. Basically, he managed to get through Hell's Gate, arrived in Long Island Sound, and said, don't want to go back that way. So he rediscovers, I guess we should say, Long Island Sound, since obviously we know Native Americans had investigated this area for thousands of years before that. But in his adventures, he does discover an island that he names after himself. So this is where we get Block Island, because every good explorer should leave their name somewhere. And he does sail all the way around Long Island. When he comes back, this is the map that he actually presented to the General Assemblies of the Netherlands, where he said, I have discovered a Long Island. And that was really where the name came from, and it ultimately stuck with all of the different European groups as you go forward. This is going to be an area that is going to be explored. Even early on, without a lot of the charts, it was seen as an area that needed to be explored simply because of how much different types of fish there. That was really bounteous. So it says, those fishes are so tame that many are caught with the hand. In some of the bays of the East River, the codfish are very plenty. Some of the sources go even further that said all you had to do was put your hand in the water and draw it out, and you would have a striper in your hand. I don't think we can quite do that today. I'm sure if we look at the fisheries, they've definitely declined. But it does push settlement, because this is an area that's seen as incredibly fruitful and incredibly bountiful. And ultimately, we're going to see settlement on both sides of the Long Island Sound, in the areas of Connecticut, and obviously in the areas closer to Long Island. One of the things that we often forget about, we often think of the water historically as a dividing point. I know a lot of grade schools, high schools talk about how the American Revolution was inevitable. There was that big pond between Europe and the Americas. The thing to keep in mind is water transportation was actually the simplest way to get around. And Long Island is going to prove to have really simple ways. There's not a huge amount of distance from any spot on the island to a waterway. And so you're going to see very quickly settlement coming up. If we look at settlement on Long Island, our earliest towns are out in the East End: Southampton, East Hampton, Southold. They were settled in the 1640s by the English. And one thing to kind of note, Josie and I were talking about this before the class, is how many of you have been to like Southampton Village? Anyone? East Hampton Village? Think about the location of those villages. Someone said, yep. Oh. One of the things that they knew back then is don't live on the water. You want to live near the water, but if you live on the water, we get events like hurricanes, nor'easters, flood surge. And so think about where those early villages are. They're close enough that you can walk to get the resources from the waters, but far enough away that they are much more protected. And you will see that ultimately the waterways shape our early settlements. If you look at the English, and for those of you who aren't familiar with Long Island history, the English will settle eastern Long Island. We have the Dutch in western Long Island, New York City area. That is thanks to Adrian Block. Ultimately, though, Long Island becomes English in 1664. The English will take over. This will become the New York colony. Just to let you know, Suffolk did not want to be part of New York. We fought really hard to be part of Connecticut. So for all of you who are proud New Yorkers, it was not what our roots said. And how many of you have gone across to Connecticut? Check out the name of the county over there. That's Suffolk County. That's the other half of what we're standing in right now. But the thing to keep in mind is that all of those early English settlers that came here were first and foremost farmers. If you asked them what they did, they said farmer. Many of them had a secondary skill set because you needed carpenters, you needed blacksmiths. But ultimately, besides being a farmer, everyone was also dependent on the waterways. They needed the kind of wealth coming out of that to supplement what they were doing. Some of the earliest resources they used were pound nets. A pound net, for those of you who aren't familiar, was actually a technique that the local Algonquin Indians were using. If you look at where C is, that goes right up to the beach. And it is the idea that it basically pushes the fish, so they go swimming, go into B, and they get trapped in A. Ultimately, the thing to keep in mind is if the fish can get in the net, they can get out of the net. But ultimately, they tend to swarm. And the benefit to this is once you put it in, you don't really have to do much more than that. They'd put it in the spring. They'd go plant their crops. The downside to planting your crops in the spring is you don't have any food. So you do need a supplement, especially in those early years until the harvest comes in. How do you know when there's fish in A? Do you have to go out and check it? What do you wait for? Birds. You wait for the birds to go, oh, they're having dinner, let me go get my dinner. So it is something to keep in mind that in many ways, the waterways were definitely needed, but there was a passive element to it. They could leave the nets up and only go to them when they needed them. You will also see they used a lot of the eelgrass that would wash up on the beaches. They used that as a way to help add nutrients to the soil surrounding them, especially after the first couple of years when they planted crops after crops. They used them to insulate their houses. Unfortunately, that is why we've lost a lot of our historic homes here on Long Island. They're still insulated with dried eelgrass. When they catch fire, unfortunately, they catch fire very, very quickly. Back in the late 90s, I saw one of our 17th century houses go up. It burned in a matter of 7 minutes. And it's because of the eelgrass linkage. The other thing that they used all the way up through the 19th century, eelgrass was used to stuff furniture. So if you were sleeping on your nice mattress, you would have eelgrass, which is fine when it's soft. I kept thinking that would be very uncomfortable. The longer you sleep on that mattress, it starts to make a lot of noise. But again, 19th century furniture made on Long Island, check the insides. It probably has some eelgrass in it. A couple other things that come out of this period that we also have to be cognizant of is that the early 17th century English had very few pieces of hard currency. They weren't allowed to bring money with them. The goal of the English was to gain wealth. They were jealous of the Spanish and those treasure ships going back. So the English did not allow them to bring money here. So in order to find a system of currency, they adapted and adopted wampum. Wampum was a Native American system of reciprocity. So they would take the shells that we find all along our seashores, and they would turn them into small spherical balls, and they could use that as a system of exchange. It's often, the English simply called it Indian money. That's a real oversimplification. The idea was that you would be really exchanging information. The way I typically tell my students about this, how many of you have gotten gas recently? Who did you buy your gas from?
I have no idea.
You have no idea? Did you give them some type of money or credit card in today's sense? There was an exchange there, but it's an impersonal exchange. The idea with wampum within Native American societies is when you exchange it, we're going to know all about their kids, their house, everything. It's a personal connection. We have definitely lost that element. And ultimately, wampum use by the English will impact the Native American societies. They start to produce more and more wampum to meet our needs. It does change. But Long Island was one of the leading producers across the United States for wampum. It can also be used if you string it together to tell stories. There's a memory aid that comes with it. So again, when you're walking the beaches and you see those purple and blues on the shells, if you feel a little crafty, you can go make some wampum. Wampum does disappear. We do start to get hard currency by the end of the 17th century. But in the 1690s, if you wanted to take a ferry from Brooklyn to Manhattan, it did cost 9 pieces of wampum still. So it does stay in circulation for a long period of time. What ultimately replaces wampum is not whales, but it's what whales produce. We actually suspect that some of the earliest whales caught by Europeans in the New World were caught here on Long Island, right off the shore of Amagansett. This was a technique known as shore whaling. And it really is what's considered the first cash crop for Long Islanders. And it was a communal venture. We'll see shore whaling starting within 4 years of East Hampton's settlement. They're definitely the leaders if you think about where East Hampton's located. And it was an entire community event. Young kids would actually be out of school during the whaling migration periods. They would often camp out on the hills. As soon as they'd see a whale, they'd go, "Whale off!" and shout it so that it would go through town. And they would very quickly take shore whaling boats, which are about 28 feet long. They can hold up to 6 people, and push them in. And basically, they got to row after the whale. Now, the downside to all of this is, from the time they spot the whale to the time that they get the boat in the water, the whale did not stop. So you basically get to go row, 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 row your little boat. And they would chase the whale. Now, I'm not going to do to you what I do to my students in class. I usually have a student volunteer to be the whale. And we do kill the whale in my class. But the thing to keep in mind is when you talk about harpooning a whale, it does take a lot of skill set. And usually the first catch of the whale, you're really just attaching your boat to the whale itself. It's an older system, goes back thousands of years, where the whale is going to keep going because it's basically been irritated. And you're hoping by the whale dragging this boat, it will slowly get tired so you can get close enough to give that final death hit. So a couple of things to keep in mind is that you could be attached to the whale for anywhere up to 72 hours, if you look at the early records, as you go on this venture. Eventually, it will be nicknamed the Nantucket Sleigh Ride, because you're basically bouncing over all of the waves. Eventually, and I am volunteering Glenn on this one because he's a lovely individual, eventually you get close enough to kill the whale, you kill him. How do you know the whale's dead? You wait. Well, that could take a while. The favorite whale to catch was the right whale, not because it was right-finned. It was the right one to catch because of the amount of oil. And the way you could tell the whale had died during this period in the 17th century is, well, typically when you hit the whale, you hit the heart or you hit the lungs. And the last breath, guess what comes pouring out of the blowhole? Lots of blood and whatever other whale snot and anything you can imagine. Now, I'm this close to the whale. Thank you, whale. They would be covered in it. How many of you are familiar with the term fire in the hole? This is actually the basis of that term. It wasn't a military term. It's fire in the blowhole. Now that we've killed our whale, we get to, well, row back. Eventually, they do put a sail into these boats. Go back to the shore. Now, how many of you, if you were in the whale boat covered in whale blood, what would be the first thing you would do? He's like, I'm taking the shower right away. No, 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 no. That is not what you do. You are covered in whale blood, and you are going to go strutting through town and showing off that you are strong enough to have killed a whale. Basically, he's a hot commodity now. So, if you're not married, hey, this is the way to catch a girl. I know, we kind of are like, wow, I I'm not sure I would personally have been turned on if my husband came covered in whale oil or whale blood. But what it was it proved that you had a skill necessary for communal survival. Now, the thing to keep in mind is I did say this was a community venture. The whale hunting really only took 6 people. We've used some of the children up, when they were spotting the whale. More people will be involved. While he's off flirting with any of the girls, you are also going to have women and men as well that are going to start to try out the whale. Basically, the system is they cut into the whale, they peel it, very similar to an apple. They want to get rid of all of the skin off of it as much as possible, but really peel off the blood, or excuse me, the blubber. And they're going to put it into these huge whale pots. Keep in mind, if you wander around the east end of Long Island, these are often in people's front yards. They're very decorative. But look at the sheer number of them. It does tell us how important whaling was, that they're still around. And they would basically boil the blubber until it turned into an oil. They would skim off any of the impurities. Those were called the cracklings. And they actually fed them back into the fire. Because why waste wood, which was a valuable commodity, when you had something that would burn that well? This was a job for women. This was a job for children to also assist in. They do pass a law by 1648 in East Hampton saying that it had to be done downwind because it was very pungent. But an adult right whale could produce up to 60 barrels of oil. And to put the value to this, that's equal to 3 farms. So when he's strutting around in his whale blood, he's actually proving that he can support a family. He can buy a farm. Now, interestingly enough, Long Islanders out of that right whale often were able to get 120 barrels of oil. We gain a bit of a reputation. Our whale oil barrels often had a much higher floor than the typical whale oil barrel. And so the 60 barrels of oil could often be doubled. They did start to test any barrel coming out of Long Island with a stick when it arrived in London. But we managed to pull this off for almost 2 decades. So we did end up with a reputation associated with smuggling and lawlessness and just downright cheats when it came to it. But what was so critical about this is that it does bring in hard currency. This allows Long Island in the 17th century to really shift out of a subsistence lifestyle into a much more stable economy. Now, I did want to highlight this. If you go out to East Hampton, for those of you who are familiar with the drive, if you take Sunrise Montauk Highway, they merge together. You'll eventually get to East Hampton. You have to make a left there. You keep driving down. You hit what we think of as the village today. If you look at the village, it's Main Street and Newtown Road, because today's East Hampton Village is, well, the new town. The original village is right around the pond, the cemetery, and you'll actually see this house there. This is the Mulford house. We can positively date it to 1680. We do believe it goes back to the very founding of East Hampton. It is considered one of the oldest standing homes in New York State. And it stayed in the original family of the Mulfords right to 1976 when they donated it to the Historical Society. And by the way, in 1976, they still did not have electricity or water in this house. So it's been very much in the same style since the 1720s. The reason I'm highlighting this is Samuel Mulford lived in this house. He was a whaler. He was a captain in the militia throughout the 17th century into the early 18th century. He was a very colorful character. He was described as quite patriotic, quite the Puritan, quite the obnoxious loudmouth, and that's a direct quote of what they had to say. He represented the East Hampton in the Colonial Assembly 5 different times. He was also kicked out 3 different times for being vocal in his opinions about the governor. Unfortunately, I cannot repeat any of what he said. And the impressive thing is the last time he was kicked out and he gave his speech, which is all recorded, he did not repeat himself for 30 minutes. And he was the ripe old age of 78. So he was a colorful character. In 1715, Long Island is becoming a stable economy, and the King of England recognizes that the wealth is coming from the whales. And the King of England recognizes he's not getting any of that wealth. So he proposes to have a 50% tax on all whale oil and bone. Now, when this was announced in the Colonial Assembly, before it had gone into effect, but kind of the announcement that in 6 months this will, Samuel Mulford, the best way to describe this is through a hissy fit. This was his background. This was going to hurt his community. And he was so loud in his protestations that the assembly members felt that he lacked diplomatic skills in being able to negotiate this maybe from 50% to ideally 10 or 20%. So they actually escorted him back to East Hampton and politely said, "Stay here while we negotiate." Unfortunately for them, while they did send people back to keep an eye on him, he managed to lose them, went up to Boston, caught a boat to go meet the King of England in London and give him a piece of his mind. Now, how many of you think that everyday 18th century colonial could meet with the King of England? Not likely, except there is a tradition within the English monarchy that once a month the crown will be open and that anyone can come and petition the crown, whether it's to get a pension, to have someone freed from jail. And so this was the plan of what Samuel Mulford had. Now, he is coming from East Hampton, which even today, East Hampton is kind of the middle of nowhere compared to New York City, and especially when you think about the colonies compared to England. So he did want to look good, so went out, got a nice outfit. You got to look good for the King of England. Stood in line, and unfortunately the line was quite long that day, and he did not get to see the king. So he went back to his boarding house, went to reach for his money, and he found out what London was famous for in the 17th and 18th century. The pickpockets. And so he went and went, huh. Now, obviously, this is not a gentleman who's going to take this lying down. And so the next month, gets all dressed back up again in his nice velvet jacket. You can imagine silver buttons, maybe a little lace trim. Stands in line, and you can almost imagine his smile as he starts to feel those ghostly fingers, when all of a sudden he hears a scream because he sewed fishhooks into his pocket to catch a thief. Now, is this a good story? Because this is a story told out in East Hampton. Is this simply part of local mythology? Well, a couple of things to keep in mind. We know Samuel Mulford himself is a historical figure. We do have the logbook, which in 1750 shows his passage from Boston to London. We have a red velvet jacket with silver buttons, lace trimmed, that has the name of a London tailor with the date on it. And most importantly, we have something that you guys all know. I'm assuming many of you have taken American history. What was the first tax placed on the colonists? The Stamp Act in the 1760s. There was never a whaling tax. We do know that in 1750 there were broad bills talking about a colonist who had sewn fishhooks into his pocket. And we know that some of these broad bills are actually preserved within the British Parliament. And so the idea is, we do believe this is a true story, as well as a fun story, but ultimately, we owe Samuel Fishhooks Mulford a big round of thanks, because we did not have to pay taxes. Now, unfortunately for him, shore whaling does start to die off by the 1720s. It's no longer a viable option. But Long Island will have become quite economically stable by then. Stable enough that we might be able to pay our bills, but we still have a reputation. We are known, as I said, as a place of smugglers, of lawlessness, of upstarts. And the governor of New York at the time actually sent Captain Kidd to attempt to prevent smuggling in the Long Island Sound. Now, if any of you are familiar with Captain Kidd, he ends up gaining a reputation for being a pirate himself. And according to both history and local lore out in East Hampton, we do know that he was good friends with the Gardner family out at the Gardner's Island, and that on that last fateful voyage, he does stop at Gardner Island and offload some of his treasure. Now, according to the record, the British did pick up the 4 chests. We do have an account of what was included in them. But if you go out to East Hampton today, there's still many people that say there's still a missing chest. And so they do still go looking for it periodically. I don't recommend going out to Gardiner's Island, though, and trying to dig it up. They tend to be very protective of that area. But what I want you to think about is that whaling does shape Long Island, both in the 17th, early 18th century, but again in the 19th century. We're going to see the shift from shore whaling to deep sea whaling. If you've read Moby Dick, this is the type of whaling that you should associate. And from the 1820s forward, this will be a huge economic boom. We send hundreds of vessels, first up into the North Atlantic and ultimately into the Pacific Ocean, looking for whale oil. Whale oil will be critical for industrialization. It not only lights up the factories, it is going to be used as a way to lubricate all of the industrial machinery. So there's a desperate need for it. Now, the problem with deep sea whaling is you're no longer at sea for a day, 2 days, 3 days. The average trip is 3 to 4 years. The longest trip out of Long Island was 11 years. How many of you want to sign up for a voyage that you have no idea how long it will last? Basically, the deciding factor is when your hold is filled with oil and enough whalebone to be profitable. So if you don't have a good captain who can find the whales, you're out of luck. So for the most part, this is men coming from lower socioeconomic levels, and they really try to sell it any way they can. You know, come see the world. Most of the broadbills that talk about this tend to have women from the Polynesian Islands decked out on them. There's definitely the attraction of exotic women. You know, the idea that you are going to potentially get wealthy. Very few men necessarily got any great wealth, but the wealth did roll into places like Sag Harbor. If you walked through Sag Harbor in the early 19th century, it was very cosmopolitan. You heard literally languages from all over the world. You heard not only, you know, English, French, Spanish, Italian. You heard African languages. You heard languages coming out of Asia at this time, as well as various Native Americans. And they went on these ventures looking for the whales. And one of the interesting elements is how much we know about these trips. They kept incredibly detailed logbooks, and these logbooks have been preserved because the logbooks were a way to prove the wealth that was collected, how many whales were collected. Mystic Seaport has today probably the largest collection, and they're actually putting them all online, so they're very easily accessible. You'll see that they talk not only about how many whales were caught, but the types of whales. And one of the things to keep in mind is until you find a whale, there's not much to do on these vessels. Once whales are spotted, you work 24/7. But until that point, because you do have larger crews, there's a lot of free time. We will see this is the basis for one of what's considered kind of truly American art forms, and that's tattooing. Will come out of this period, because what else does a sailor do when waiting for a whale? And most of the tattoos will be of one of two styles. They'll either show their patriotism, so they tend to be an eagle, a flag, or you will also see quite a bit of, can anyone guess? Ladies, because that's what they're missing. They also do a lot of carving. Scrimshaw is another art form that's considered very American that comes out of whaling. And most of the gifts they made were for loved ones back home, and most of them were gifts for their mothers, their wives, their sweethearts. Can anyone guess the most common piece of scrimshaw that was made? What would remind you of home if you've been at sea for 4 or 5, maybe even that 10-year period? How many of you think about food? A nice apple pie. Isn't that the traditional American idea? Pie crimpers are the most common type of scrimshaw you'll find. I worked at the East Hampton Historical Society. We had over 6,000 of them. Mystic Seaport right now is said to have had over 50,000 of them. They're incredibly common. Some of them are very simple. That's what I would have been making since I have no artistic skill. Some of them are works of art in and of themselves. Now, you will look at some of the details on the scrimshaw, and how many of you lack artistic skills? My students usually tell me that my stick figures look drunken. So I do not have artistic ability, but what they would use is they would take pictures from magazines and basically poke holes so that even those of us lacking artistic skills could preserve a piece of our whaling history and make it look well. One of the things I wanted to highlight, though, is it's not just men that go to sea for deep sea whaling. You are going to have vessels that will become known as hen frigates. These are ones that carry one, maybe two women on board, typically only the captain's wives. This is part of the 19th century, the idea, the age of romanticism, that if my husband is going to sea, whoa, how could I leave him for 4, 5, 11 years? Now, some of us might be glad. We might very gladly say, see you when you get back. But some women went. And the thing to keep in mind is that they were typically separated out. They were not expected to interact with the crew. And so there's very little that they have to do. And so they kept, again, incredibly detailed records of what was going on during the day, what they saw. So again, we know literally 24 hours a day what is happening. This is just a picture of that fire in the hole or the fire in the chimney that we did earlier with Glenn. One other element that came out of this is a continuing fascination with whaling. Ultimately, whaling does die off really by the 1850s, 1860s. Once petroleum is discovered in Pennsylvania, and once you have the Civil War, you're simply not going to have the whaling going on. Petroleum replaces the need for whale oil. The Civil War destroys most of these wooden vessels. Wooden vessels have a very short life. And many of the ones in Long Island were part of what was known as the Stone Fleet. It was sent down to blockade Charleston during the Civil War. Unfortunately, the vessels were so old that when a storm hit, they never even made it to Charleston before they sunk. And then you will also see by the turn of the 20th century, once corsets go out, there's really no need for whalebone either. However, there's still a lot of nostalgia. The last whale caught off of Long Island was actually in 1907. A group of East Hampton men who had gone whaling when they were younger basically went through this moment of nostalgia, and you can see some of the photographs from it. They basically peeled the whale, they did process the whale oil, and then they kind of went, what do we do with this? Because there was no longer a demand. They did end up sending the bones to the Natural History Museum in New York City. They were on display for a while. They came off a display in the 1930s and were lost. At the beginning of the 21st century, the museum did discover them and went, what do we do with the right whale bones? So they sent them back to East Hampton and said, here, you can display them. Since they're bigger than the museum, they are all packaged up in the basement right now with just a couple of pieces on display. So it does kind of show that history of what was going on during this period. But there's still that recognition that our culture is entwined with the local waters. You will see this continuing to play out as you go forward. You will have shipbuilding that was entwined with the whaling industry. During the mid to late 19th century, shipbuilding was the 5th largest industry in New York State, and the largest productive area, or the largest shipbuilding area, was Suffolk County. Port Jefferson actually at one point had over 400 shipyards, and in 1852 we actually built almost 300 vessels that year. So it was an incredibly productive area. It had a lot of men working in it, from shipbuilders to caulkers. So again, whaling helped to push our economy. When whaling died, so did shipbuilding. We'll see most of our shipbuilding basically remaining in the areas of like Brooklyn or going across the Sound to Connecticut. But you are going to still see wealth coming from the shores. Do I have any fans of oysters in here? For those of us who are not allergic to them, they became known as a really big delicacy during the 19th century, and the most famous ones were known as blue points, coming out of the area of Blue Point, Long Island. We sent oysters as far away as to Russia. The Tsar of Russia preferred Blue Point oysters, and Queen Victoria had Blue Point oysters every Sunday. So we were shipping all over the world, and we often say that New York City had roads paved of gold. Here on Long Island, ours were more likely paved of oysters. It does also allow for the Dutch to find a niche. Here on Long Island, as I try to say this, Blue Point, Bayport will become a heavy oystering area. In 1907, the New York State Assembly actually passes a law defining a blue point. A blue point must be an oyster that spends 3 months in the Great South Bay. And this was actually a critical factor because we were very protective of our waters. In 1861, local baymen were getting upset that fishermen from New Jersey were either coming up and just outright taking our oysters, or were taking their oysters and dipping them in the water and saying they were blue points. And so we had a little animosity for anyone from Jersey, so I apologize if anyone is now. But we kept calling in the toleration officers, what we think of as the local maritime authorities. And in 1861, they kept ignoring us. Any guesses why? Who knows their American history?
They were from New Jersey.
No, they weren't from New Jersey. They were New Yorkers, but in 1861, we're in the middle of the Civil War. They thought this was a relatively minor problem. So a group of baymen decide the only way to get the attention of the capital, of the state capital, is to secede from Long Island. And so in 1861, we have the creation of the Rockaway Country. This quickly got the attention not only of the toleration officers, but also of the Union Navy. And they came to this area right along the South Shore, and amazingly enough, not only did the New Jersey fishermen disappear, but so did those who had proclaimed the Rockaway Country. But it did lead to more protection of our waterways. So again, our reputation for being a little on the lawless side continued right into the 19th century, and ultimately we're going to see it continuing into the 20th century. Long Island was infamous during the 1920s for rum running. Our nickname here on Long Island was Rum Row. Thanks to the fact that we have, over 1,100 miles of beaches, this was an ideal area. Most of those beaches could not be patrolled by the Coast Guard or local policing authorities, so people were involved in this. We also had a prime location. While some of the alcohol, and we do have to admit quite a bit of the alcohol that arrived on Long Island was drunk on Long Island, we also did ship it to New York City, where, thanks to the railroad, it was shipped all over the eastern seaboard. Our counterpoint on the western seaboard is Seattle. This is where pretty much all of the alcohol came in between 1920 and 1933. And so you saw massive pushes for rum running, but also to support the law, because Prohibition was passed, said that you could not manufacture, distribute, or ultimately you should not be drinking during this period. And Long Island becomes known for thumbing our nose. If you've watched or read The Great Gatsby, it was set right here locally in Stony Brook. We actually had the Great Gatsby house until they tore it down to make really ugly townhouses. There's a little bitterness there, I will admit, on that one. But it is something to recognize. And so you will see this taking place throughout this entire area. Long Island becomes famous for a couple of different points. If you are familiar with the Freeport Marina, which is still in existence, during the period of Prohibition, they built 20 different boats. The first one they built was for a rum runner, and they turned around and looked at the Coast Guard and said, "Hey, did you hear about the new rum running boat? It's 10 feet with a 5-horsepower engine. We'll build you a 20-foot one with double that engine." And then they went back to the rum runners and said, "Did you hear about that new Coast Guard boat?" They built 10 for the Coast Guard and 10 for the rum runners, and they do have models of all of them. They all got significantly bigger, significantly more horsepower, and significantly more heavily armored. We do have to recognize that this was a period of violence that took place. We had all-out battles that took place on our beaches on the South Shore between rum runners and local Coast Guard and policing forces. We also had issues here in Long Island with the KKK. During this period, we see a rise in KKK participation. One of the things to keep in mind, Suffolk County in the 1920s, 1 in 7 people belonged to that organization, and they believed in being 100% American, which meant upholding the laws. So on the South Shore, we also had KKK vigilantes who were also attempting to support the Prohibition law. So you had a lot of levels of violence, but people were still willing to rum run. Two of the examples I wanted to kind of point out is William McCoy. Have you ever heard the phrase, the real McCoy? Comes from him because he was known for not watering down his whiskey, which is a grave sin, of course. But he's also known for never having gotten caught, even though he was stopped by the Coast Guard 17 times. What he would do is he would cover his bottles in a crust of salt. As soon as he saw the Coast Guard coming, he would throw the bottles overboard so that he could quickly be seen as a clean ship. And of course, what happens to salt in water? It dissolves, and thanks to that cork in his whiskey, the bottles would pop up, he would grab them out, head to shore, and he managed to get all of his whiskey through. He never lost a single bottle of whiskey to any of the authorities. Claudio's is a great example. I encourage you to go out to Greenport because unfortunately Claudio's is being sold. But it's one of our oldest hotels and restaurants in the United States. And again, it was known for the rum running. If you go to Claudio's and you look at the bar, you can actually see they can come in right under the bar because it's on the docks. And there's a nice hatch there, and they would literally just lift it up. You also have that for those of you who might go out to Southampton. When you cross over the canal, there was actually a tunnel from the canal to that building that's now falling down. That was went through a couple of different names, but it was a popular hotel that was famous for its drinking. It had all of the major stars out there. The governor of New York came to drink out there, the mayor of New York City. Any of you familiar with a 1920s, 1930s star by the name of Bing Crosby? His first paying gig was out in this area, playing to these audiences. So again, Long Island has a lot of rum running history. If you buy a house, an older house on Long Island, especially on the South Shore, go into the basement. If it was built during the 1920s or prior to that, look at where the doors are. Wherever the door is open, look behind the door, and you will often still be able to find a rum hole where they would hide the alcohol. I have a 1926 house. We have two of them. And I did a little research, and evidently the family was quite active in Islip in their rum running. They actually sold their whiskey for $1 a taste. So you had a lot of money. You could buy up in the Nassau, you could get a pitcher of beer for $2. You could also get whiskey being made locally, often known as rotgut, because it was made in bathtubs or bathtub gin. So again, Long Island drank through this entire period. But it does play into our local maritime history, that what allowed this money to flow into Long Island. And in the 1920s, we were a very strong economy, was because of our access to the waterways. It's going to shape us, not always legally, we do have to recognize, but ultimately it will shape this environment. And as many of you guys know, it continues to shape our environment today. We still have heavy fishing. Obviously, we have lots of marine research going on, so it's helping to support Stony Brook University. I had to throw up a picture of at least one of our research vessels from out there. So this is a very brief tour of Long Island's maritime history, and really what I want you guys to take from it is how involved historically we have been in our marine environments, that we have needed them to survive, whether it was simply to put food on our tables, to as a way to expand our economy so that we could start to bring in finer elements, to be able to buy better materials to build furniture with, to ultimately having a little fun because you could drink now because we had access to alcohol, and then funding ultimately our own interests in saving the marine environment. One of the things to keep in mind is, while we started out hunting the whales, today we're probably more likely to go hashtagging and taking selfies if we possibly can when you think about areas like Montauk that have whale watches going on. So we're very much still entwined with our maritime environments. In the summertime, probably half of you will be spending it at the beaches. It's still one of our largest economic sources. And that's just a quick tour. So. Any questions? Anything I can answer? Okay.
So, despite this long history of association with the ocean and the marine system, you don't sense the same sort of relationship now and dedication to it that, say, you get around the Chesapeake Bay. The states around the Chesapeake Bay seem much more engaged with preserving and being involved with the marine system. So how do you explain that difference?
You know, it is something that we do have to recognize. In some ways, I don't necessarily know why the Chesapeake preserves it where we lose it. But one thing to keep in mind is if you look at American history overall, historically, we're dependent on marine environments. From the very beginning, if you think about where all the early colonies are, it's maritime monies and economies that pay for manifest destiny. The money's coming in from fishing, go into the banks that help to build the railroads. And one of the things that you will see with America in general is we tend to go from being very much a society based around marine economies to continuing to be. We have to recognize trade. If you go into New York City and look at all of the trade coming in, we're still dependent on it in that sense, but we ignore it. We really based our identity around land. Go west, buying up 160 acres of farmland. And I think in many ways Long Island was reflective of that overall change that took place. Areas like the Chesapeake do ultimately continue to preserve that. And it is one of the things that interests me of why did they manage to do it? And I can't give you a hard answer on it. I do think Long Island, in part, probably due to its proximity to New York City and it being an economic hub that helps to fund westward expansion, does kind of get dragged into looking very landward. We put a lot of emphasis on farming. Even in the beginning, everyone identified themselves first as a farmer. Fishing was always secondary, so even though we were dependent on it, culturally, we did not acknowledge it from the beginning. And I suspect down in the Chesapeake, they identified much more readily first as fishers rather than necessarily always as farmers. I think that original identity of the land, and oh yes, we need these elements. I mean, we were dependent on it. We didn't always talk about it, though. And I think that may be the difference, if that makes sense.
To what extent did Native American peoples whale before European contact?
They definitely were part of the whaling societies. We have a lot of gaps in our knowledge. We know that they whaled for food. We know that there were religious purposes for whaling. We don't really know a lot about how they fit in, how whaling fit into their spiritual practices. But we did learn the whaling skills from the Native Americans. If you think about England prior to this, they are not particularly a whaling society. Whaling had been done in Europe for thousands of years, but not really the English weren't involved. So when we look at whalers on Long Island or whalers up in the New England area in general, they're learning from the local Native American societies. And if you look at the original whaling crews, both initially when it's a communal venture and eventually it does become a private enterprise, capitalism at work, most of them will still have a Native American as part of the crew. The Shinnecocks are known for their harpooning skills. And it's interesting, if you look at the East Hampton and Southampton town records, the contracts for the Native Americans with these whaling ventures were actually made part of the town records. They weren't private. And part of that had to do with kind of differing views on what a contract meant and how it was held, but they were definitely critical. It's only as skills get learned and fine-tuned do we see them being pushed out. But no, they were definitely very critical to this.
I'd like to go back to Bob's question because I think it's an important one. Being a native Marylander,
maybe you can.
Marylander, I think there are two things that are that I've always thought about. One, the Chesapeake Bay is a lot shallower, more accessible to small boats. There are tons of tributaries that expand the availability. And Long Island has a terrible history of trying to keep people at the beaches. You know, every community says, thou shalt allow only the people that live here to go to the beach, and if you go out to East Hampton and try to go to the beach, it costs you a fortune, or you have to park 3 miles away. So I think we have been very poor in promoting our marine resources by essentially keeping people away. And I will never forget teaching a high school course here a number of years ago to kids in Brentwood. None of them, it was about 30 kids, none of them had ever been to a beach. And so I think we have, as a population, have been very remiss in trying to promote our marine resources.
I do think there is an important element when you compare the Chesapeake and the fact that, as you said, it's more shallow, there's a lot more tributaries. You do have to recognize with those early settlements in like East Hampton, Southampton, you are on open ocean. Again, there's kind of a limited access unless you have a certain skill set, unless you have the boats. These are not as easy of areas to necessarily directly interact with the waters. Where I think in the Chesapeake, again, there's a little bit of an openness. More people are able to, and more people in the sense of not just men, but more women are working. If you look at the Chesapeake, at some of the history of shell fisheries, they do mention more often women being involved. We don't really hear that here in the East End. Again, there's that separation. There's still kind of a land focus rather than focusing on the waterways. And we did, while whaling is the cash crops, it is interesting that those monies went into land-based activities to fund more farming, to fund new crop types of fertilizers, things like that. They're still taking what you have from the waterways and focusing on the land, where I think down there they continue to keep the focus on the water with the economy based in of the water.
I know you're looking back on this, but just to concur on what he just said now, I'm originally from Indiana, so it's really, since coming out here, I'm an accountant who's going back to school for chemistry, but I want to do something outside, field work of some kind. It's really been struck me in the last 3.5 years in suburban New York here, just whether it's a matter of oppression or disinterest, the number of people, not just in a place like Brentwood, but also in a place like Garden City, where a lot of people in any given week or any given year don't go to the shore, even if they can, afford it. I guess I'm just curious, this is a matter of geography or being in the middle of the ocean or the climate. Looking forward, what advantages does Long Island or coastal New York still have can be useful economically or socially, that's not directly tied to business in Manhattan or business by flying out somewhere from Queens?
I mean, I do agree, and it's interesting. I talk to a lot of students and go, "How many of you have been to the beaches? Why do you go to the beaches?" A lot of them go, and I'm like, "Did you go in the water?" And they're like, "Oh, no." I'm like, so in other words, you could have met that group of people anywhere. It just happened to be at the beach.
They might as well be from Indiana. Seriously.
Being from Ohio, I do understand that. One thing, though, we do have to recognize as well, I think it is sad how many locals may not partake of it. It is still a huge draw in tourism. We do sell the beaches. People come out. This is, again, it's a changing industry, but we do draw a lot of people. Again, with the recession, that's changed part of our economics. If you look, if you think back to like the 80s and the 90s, the Hamptons. What drew people to the Hamptons was in a large part the beaches. They wanted to go down there. Back in the 90s, when there was an issue with the piping plover nesting, because they're protected in New York, and on Main Beach there was so many nests that basically the entire beach was blocked off. And they were petitioning and said the only reason people come to East Hampton is to go to Main Beach. So if you block it off to protect this animal,
right,
you're also going to kill the economy. So we do have to recognize the element of tourism. So not necessarily people who are local. Again, we do have a huge recreational element. While I do think a lot of young people are not necessarily, you do see recreational boating being very big on Long Island. If you go down to like Port Jefferson in the summertime, how many boats are in there? I know I worked for marinas. That was part of what I did during graduate school. And there is a healthy recreational boating community, and most of those are families that have been here for generations. If you start talking to a lot of them, their father owned a boat, their grandfather owned a boat. So there is still a cultural element. And again, I think it's changing over time, and it's harder to, I think, with kind of modernity, and part of it is recessions. I mean, one of the biggest things we saw with marinas is that that's a luxury item to own a boat.
I was in Connecticut. We went around New Haven, New London. People were just abandoning boats, and then they were a hassle for a Coast Guard or anything they ran into, like 5 years ago. Just as a very quick follow-up, I apologize. I guess I was just wondering, like, how can you have renew, and the recession is over, although by people in my family that don't believe that for personal reasons. I mean, how do you have, being the most crowded large island in the world with a population density higher than Pittsburgh, as an economic driver, as a unique location that can't be, outsourced or done online, and still have a place that, is frankly worth living?
I mean, this is part of the debates. I mean, that's what we've seen. Now we build right up to the shorelines.
Right.
And there's, the pushes, again, of access to the beaches. One of the interesting elements, you can't have private beaches. We have town beaches, but you don't have, like if you go out to California where you have celebrities who basically say, you can't walk in front of my house, this is the beach. We do have a document that actually shapes Brookhaven, Southampton, East Hampton towns, the Dongan Patent, which goes back to the 1680s. And that actually gives control of basically the underwater surfaces to the towns. So there is at least it being available at least to the local community. And the argument is, it's, if you're not in the community, as you said, if you go out to East Hampton, it's expensive to get a pass. But it is something we have to recognize. We are building right up to the beaches. How is that going to shape our kind of upcoming society? With the recession, people sold their boats. Marinas went out from under. Most of our marinas were family owned. Most of them made it through the recession itself, but have not made it through the past 5 years, kind of the post-recession downturn. And again, that's going to impact people's access to recreational vessels. We're seeing the downturn of people not buying a boat, which means they may not grow up on a boat. They may not grow up on the water. So again, there's a couple of different elements. I wish I could put a positive spin to this. Unfortunately, I can't.
In the last few years, the last marina in Stamford, Connecticut, and the last marina in Red Bank, New Jersey, is both closed.
Mm-hmm.
That's a shame. Thanks. Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine.
So, thanks very much for coming, and there is lunch, so if anyone wants to continue discussion with Dr. Ryder, that would be great. Thank you.
Enjoy. Thank you.